Today on the Cameron Journal podcast, we are joined by Dixiane Hillaj. She is the author of Unfolding the Arab-Israeli Conflict, which is a story about her husband and their life in the West Bank for 6 years and how he was not able to return after coming to the U.S. for a sabbatical. Very tragic situation, but oh so prescient given present circumstances and ceasefires and all this type of thing that we've talked about on the Cameron Journal News Hour. So I've been looking forward to this conversation since it was booked. I have had a variety of people, Palestinians, on this show. I had an anti-Zionist Jewish woman on the show. I had a editor of a Palestinian literary collection from Ramallah on the show years ago, which is amazing. Amidst all of that, they have a literary community, which is just mind-blowing. And so I've been looking forward to this conversation so much. So welcome, Dixiane, to the Cameron Journal podcast.
You. Actually, the book was written by my husband.
Oh, good.
And unfortunately, he's no longer with us, but putting it together and getting it ready for publication and publishing it actually, I think, kept me sane during this past year.
I'm sure. Well, and so he's passed recently then.
Well, not really. It was 7 years ago, but
oh, well, that's okay. That's fine then. No, but hey, projects come together when they come together, and if it was important to you in the last year to keep you sane, then that's the power of story. We're excited to talk about it all the same.
Yes.
Well, why don't we start right off, and why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and the book?
Okay. The book is basically a historical account of the very beginnings of the problem. And I think even though it was written a long time ago, the message is important today because so many people, they know that what's happening today is wrong, but they don't know the roots of it. So it's very hard to get to a solution when you just know that today I'm unhappy with it.
Yes, that is very true. So your husband must have been born near around the time of Israeli independence in 1948.
Yes, he was actually a teenager then, and his memories of that time are included in here, and it makes it less of an academic book and more of he was there.
Yeah, and these are real people that were really affected by all of this.
Yes.
Right. So, well, let's also fold you in. When did you meet your husband?
I met him at university, which is not surprising. That's where people come together.
Of course.
4.5 months after I met him, we got married.
Well, where'd you go to school?
The University of Florida in Gainesville.
Oh, wonderful. I have a family who lived down there for years and years and years and used to do art exhibitions down there. I know the area well. So, yeah.
Yes.
So, yes. No, that's wonderful. So one of the big things you mentioned was that you lived together for 6 years in the West Bank. Tell us everything. What was that like?
We did live under occupation, and it was at times very stressful, more so for him than for me, because he was in a position of responsibility. He was the vice president for academic affairs of Birzeit University. And when the president of the university had been exiled, so the vice president often left to go on fundraising tours in the Gulf or on other business. And my husband was pretty much in charge. And it's soldiers would come in and you would, we'd try to keep them off the campus, but they had the guns and we didn't. And they would sometimes just take a student away. Mm-hmm. And the students would strike and classes would be postponed. Sometimes the Army would get upset for one thing or another and they'd close the whole university.
I can't imagine the daily emotional up and down of all of that.
Yes. And my husband happened to be in this country getting an education in 1967 when the war happened. Mm-hmm. And because he was not on the ground to be counted in the census, he did not get residency on the West Bank. Mm. So we were there on visitor's permit.
I see.
A visitor's permit is good for 30 days. And then he had to go to the military governor's office and get it renewed for 30 days. And he could do that twice. And then he had to leave the country and re-enter on a new permit. And we lived like that for 6 years.
Oh my God, that is absolutely crazy. What was the daily life for you? Like, where did you shop for groceries? How did you cook food? Like, it must have been so different from, especially Florida. Like, not climate, same climate, but just daily life. How did you manage?
I developed what they call, my husband called siege mentality. He just always had a lot of food in the house that would keep. Mm. If the electricity went off, we had a gas stove, we had dried beans, we had rice, and we would go to the market when we were allowed. Sometimes the curfews would be days at a time. So you had to have something around. I had 3 children.
Oh yeah, I was going to ask if you had children. Yes, absolutely. Yes. No, that's. Even just emotionally, psychologically, watching him leave, come in, visitor permit, this office, that office. How emotionally, how was that for you?
Strangely enough, you kind of get used to it.
Yeah.
It becomes just part of life. The worst part was when the kids would demonstrate. My oldest son was in high school, and he was everyone on the occupied territories is very politically aware.
How can you not be? Yeah.
Yes. How can you not be? And I said, he was out there throwing stones. And I said, you don't have to do that. He said, yes, I do. I'm not better than the other kids. What makes me better? Why should I stay home and be safe? And he didn't. He was out there.
Oh, that was the hardest. I was about to say that let's just take 5 minutes as a mother for the emotions of that. We'll just take a minute to digest that statement.
Yeah. Yeah. I did a lot of pacing up and down.
Yes. I can only imagine. And I mean, it, uh, did you learn the local language? Did you make friends?
Yes. Well, before we went to Palestine, we spent 5 years in Jordan
Ah,
until we had the chance to go in,
right.
And I lived with my husband's family for a while, and
Mm,
they were amazing at teaching me Arabic and putting up with my rather insensitive remarks sometimes that
yeah,
know things are
that's
different and you don't always recognize why.
yeah. Yeah, no, that's very, very true. And so, did they like you? Are you still in contact with any of them still?
Yes, yes. Um, his nieces, they we Skype not regularly, but fairly often,
Yeah.
and we are in touch. I've been back since his death. I've been back twice, and they keep wanting me to come back more and stay longer. But it's a long trip.
It is, especially at a lady of a certain age. It's quite a bit to get over there.
Yeah.
I remember the last time I booked my Nana, who's 85 this year, to fly anywhere. I finally conned her into taking the little wheelchair at the airport. She's like, but I can walk. I'm not immobile. I'm like, yeah, but the airport is big. Just and she's like, it was so nice being wheeled around, and I went right through security. I'm like, see, it's not so bad. But that was, and then she's like, but this one time after that, I'm done. So I can, and that was just to go into Arizona. I cannot imagine international travel, sort of thing. It's a lot. It's
Yeah.
all that walking and passports and customs, and oh, what a burden.
Right.
Yes. And then there's the getting into the West Bank part, which is its own drama that takes
Well,
hours. And
most of his immediate family is in Jordan.
oh, well, that's not so bad then.
Yeah,
That's not
it's
quite so
it's
bad.
easier, but the
Yes.
the West Bank is very hard. There was a time when I traveled with 8 passports in my purse
Yeah.
because I had to have a passport for myself and the 3 boys,
Right.
the regular passport, and then to go into occupied territory. Arab countries wouldn't let you in if you had an Israeli stamp on your passport. So I had, because of the frequency of our travel, I had another whole set of passports. And I would, when the bus that carries you from one side to the other was on the bridge, I would put one set back in my purse and pull out the other set.
Yeah.
The bridge crossed the Jordan River, and that
Yes.
was from Jordan to the occupied territory.
That is the perils of all of that. So let's talk a little bit about your husband. So now that we've kind of done all of that, we'll turn back to him for a minute. Um, so he is a teenager in the West, goes to Independence, all this type of thing, goes to University of Florida, meets a lovely lady such as yourself, and gets married, has 3 kids. He's at this university, all this type of thing. What was his education in? What did he educate himself in?
International relations, political
Oh,
science.
he and I have something in common. My master's degree is in that.
Oh, nice. Yes,
Yes. So no,
yes.
that's tremendous. Um, it's no, that's very cool. So he was at the university, and then you mentioned that you lived there for 6 years, and then he was not allowed to return. I guess this is the part of the story where we get into the not allowed to return part.
Okay. Well, I said he was on a visitor's permit,
Right.
and so when he came here as a visiting scholar to Harvard,
Mm-hmm.
and that was on a sabbatical year. He did research for a book,
Yeah.
and then the university has to submit a request for a visitor.
Hmm.
And the request was denied.
Hmm.
And it was repeatedly denied.
Hmm.
And they said it was because he had been to a conference with a member of the PLO. He had appeared in the same as a speaker at the same conference. And he said there was also an employee of the Israeli embassy that also spoke at that conference. Is he not allowed to come home?
Yeah.
And of course, that was a rhetorical question.
Right. Yes. So then I guess that was how you guys had to take up in America.
Yeah.
So then what did he do in this country?
Um, he worked for a couple of nonprofit organizations because we didn't get notified that they couldn't get, it was a final no more appeals for the visitor's permit until the summer before we were supposed to start back teaching. And you don't get a teaching position in the summer for the coming year. I mean, it doesn't work that way.
True.
But he did get a director of the I can't even remember the name of the first nonprofit.
Yeah, that was a long time ago. It's okay.
It was a long time ago, and it no longer exists. So
yes, it's fine. So were you did you guys all come as a family to the sabbatical year, or were you separated?
No, we came as a family.
Oh, well, that's a relief. You didn't have to then find out, oh, he's not coming home and we also have to move. So not only is he stuck in America, but get boxes and bags. So fortunately, you were all here.
Yeah, we were here.
That's really good. So so what is the principal ideas in the book? What does he write about? What does he tell us about this region, this people, this conflict?
Well, it starts with the beginnings of Zionism, of modern Zionism, when the Dreyfus trial, he was a French officer who was wrongly committed of treason, and he happened to be Jewish. And Europe was highly anti-Semitic at the time. And the people were chanting, death to the Jews. They're not loyal to France. They're loyal to their own people. And Theodor Herzl, who was a reporter from Austria, he was traumatized by hearing that. He happened to be Jewish as well. And he thought all these mobs of people want to kill the Jews. And he began to think that the only solution was to have a state that was just for the Jews, where they could all come together and they wouldn't have to live with the Gentiles.
Right.
And at the time, Palestine was part of the Ottoman Empire. It was a time of empires, the Ottoman Empire, the British Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And he thought that the Ottomans were having problems of their own, and he offered to buy Palestine. And much the way someone recently wanted to buy another piece of property that didn't belong to him.
Yes.
And But the Sultan was said, rightly so, he says, the land does not belong to me, it belongs to its people, and it's not for sale. And he was a friend of the Rothschilds who had enough money probably to buy a country if it were for sale.
Right.
And this was the beginning. And then he just had this idea and he kept pulling more and more people into it.
Yeah, the first
And
Zionist conference in 1889, and then later on you get the Balfour Declaration, and then conveniently the Ottoman Empire falls apart and Palestine becomes a British mandate. And yes,
yeah, well, Britain really wanted it, not because they wanted Palestine, but it was the way to India. And India was the crown, the jewel in the crown.
right.
And this guarded the eastern flank of the Suez Canal.
Yes, and all their holdings in Egypt, which was British at the time as well. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Right. So, yes, yeah, so so then I gather then he takes us through sort of the mandate period, and which is his teenagehood and all this type of thing. And then the early days of Israel being a nation. What were the early days of Israel being a country? Like, most people don't know what the early, I mean, what was it like on the ground as a young Palestinian guy, and all of a sudden you're not British anymore. Today, it's now Israel, and you're in this new country, and also, by the way, we're not going to give you citizenship either. So that's that's a whole other discussion. What was the early days of independence for Israel like?
It was very violent. It
Yeah.
was violent under the mandate. And
Yes.
it was the British had opened up to unlimited immigration. And in the 40s, when the Second World War came along, the Jews were persecuted and
Right.
they needed a place to go. And unfortunately, the Europeans didn't want them. So they said, we can put them in Palestine. And they opened it up and allowed tens of thousands of immigrants. And it formed actually gangs of people, of men that would terrorize a village. And sometimes even worse than just terror. I mean, the Deir Yassin massacre is famous. They wiped out the population of an entire village. Brutally.
Yeah. I'm
And
working on a book called A Suite at the King David Hotel about the mandate period right before the war. And it was, to your point, when I did my research on that, much messier than I anticipated. Gangs, terrorism, bombings, all of the above sort of thing, all of the above. Yes, it was a lot more, endless conferences and pressers and white papers about the Jewish question and what are we going to do about all this, and it was, yes. It was a lot. It was a lot. And I can only imagine coming of age, being a child during the war and all this is happening, and then coming of age as a young person, and then all of a sudden you've lived on this land your whole life, your family's been here, and all of a sudden it's not yours anymore. Inconvenient.
well, he was, the West Bank did not get taken in 48.
Right.
So he was living in his hometown, is Qalqilia, which is right on the border.
Mm.
And they defended their town. The women's the women sold their marriage gold. You know, in the Middle East, the women would get bracelets and gold when they're married, and that is their money. So if anything happens to their husband, or if it's, something goes wrong, they have resource to live. But they sold their marriage gold to buy weapons. They had no weapons. They were farmers.
Right.
And they sent a delegation out, and they came back with rifles that had been buried in the First World War in the Sahara. And most of them didn't work. They couldn't find ammunition for them. They had to try and make ammunition. But they defended their town themselves because the Arab soldiers didn't have any orders. They were there from all the Arab countries saying we're going to take care of you, but they didn't have a unified command, and they never had orders to engage, which is something he went into at detail, and how frustrating it was for everyone. Well, except the invaders. The Arab soldiers that came to do something, and the Iraqi officer said when he was leaving, because he was recalled, he said, I have to go home and they'll ask me, what did you do in the war? And I'll say, I sat around and drank tea. He said, I don't like that either.
Yeah.
And so the myth is that there were these Arab hordes that came in, and brave little Israel defeated them. It didn't quite work that way.
Yes.
But they did defend their town and their land. And then during the armistice, they lost the land anyway without a shot being fired.
Yeah, I was about to ask them, given how much occupation has happened, I imagine that poor little town, everyone has had to long move on because it's been occupied.
Yeah, but the town is there, but the land, their farmland, the people would live in a town, but they would own the land around it for the farms.
Right.
And there are men, when we were there, when it was occupied, there were men who worked as day laborers in their own orange groves that had been taken. And I said, how can you do that? How can you get up every morning and go to work knowing that this should have been yours? And he answered, and he said, I'm not doing this for them. I'm doing it for the trees. I serve the trees.
Yeah.
And God willing, I may have them back again someday.
Mm-hmm.
That was his answer.
That is impressive. Although, as an African American with a family that came from sharecropping, I understand the mood. Definitely. I get the vibe. My father's family were sharecroppers. That's what happened after we came off the plantation. So I definitely understand working land you do not own. We have a great tradition of that among my people. So
yes.
But
it's kind of worse when it's land you used to own.
Yeah, that's the extra humiliation. It's like, last week we owned this. This week we just work here. Like, terrible, and just be, just there for the orange trees and whatnot. That's always the side of the story. I'm so glad you said that, because that's the side of the story that people don't talk about. It's those humiliations that pile up over the years. I mean, today we see the footage of people being thrown out of their houses and Jewish people being moved in and all this type of thing. But you go back, it's like that's some, that was, your husband's family. That gets passed down, to the children. This used to be ours, and then one day it wasn't. And
Right. We when once we went to visit the town when his father came to his father could come sometimes on a visitor's permit during the summer. And we took him back to Kalkilia and we went to visit his house. It had people living in it, and
Mhm.
they didn't pay rent to him. They paid rent to the Israeli military governor or someone. I don't know.
Yeah,
But the house just didn't belong to him anymore. That
yeah,
was his father's house and his grandfather's house. And
yeah. And there's, I mean, thousands of those same cases throughout the whole region. And it's
yes,
just, yeah. And that's, I mean, that's your inheritance. That's not your inheritance. That's your children's inheritance. Gone in a blink of an
yes,
eye. Gone.
yes.
That's ah, that's all quite impressive. So, how did your once you guys came to America in that terrible situation, all that type of thing, and he's working in nonprofits? How often were you guys able to go visit his family in Jordan and things like that?
Not not very often. I mean, he went more often than I did. He chaired the a citizens' rights organization that was Palestinian. He became a member of the Palestine National Council
Mm,
while we were living here. It's the governing body of Palestine,
mm,
and he was a representative, one of the representatives of the diaspora, and so he
mm.
was part of the Palestine National Council, and he was very active with that, and so he traveled quite a bit back and
Yeah,
forth.
yeah. It's yeah, fascinating. No, that's I mean that's good. He was able to do that work and advocate and, hopefully make life a little bit easier for people who've been displaced in refugee camps in Jordan and all that sort of thing. That's yeah.
And he was, as when the peace process was going on, he was the head of the delegation for refugee rights and things until that fell apart.
Yeah. That's oh yeah. That's a lot. How I cannot imagine, but how has all this affected your children?
My children are very proud of being Palestinian. They
That's impressive.
definitely identify as Palestinian. Um, my oldest son, the one that was the rock thrower, can still throw a rock and hit his target. uh, and so the middle one, who was much younger and didn't get caught up in the politics of things, but he's the one who speaks only Arabic to his children, and they
Mm,
answer in Arabic. So he's keeping it alive, and all three of them have their own ways of doing that.
that's quite impressive. So, well, I don't think we mentioned it on the recording, but before the recording, your husband's been gone for 7 years. I'll admit, my voice is dying because I've done 4 recordings today, so we're going to start to wrap up. But what's one message you would like listeners to take away about this book, about your husband, about the Palestinian people?
I think one message is that a great injustice has been done, and it's not going to go away unless people really understand that what's causing it is the partition. And they just have to learn to make, I don't think that the two-state solution is a solution. There are too many settlements. They're too intertwined geographically now.
Mm.
But a ceasefire is only the first step.
Yeah.
If the ceasefire even holds. It's
And so
long.
many have not. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't hold that much hope for it, but
Yeah. Yeah, that was the center of the protests about the the war and genocide in Gaza over the last year and the student protests last spring and all this type of thing was around, the injustice of it all. And I have to
right.
say, a lot of people don't know this, but in the African American community, we have had a lot of solidarity, not publicly, but kind of privately amongst ourselves when there's no white people around, no offense, sort of thing. A lot of solidarity because it's kind of like, not our exact situation, but we get you all. Like, we understand. Like,
We do. And I think that we're very grateful for that. I've seen it at the demonstrations, and it's nice.
yeah, and I
Yeah,
think that, yeah.
oppression knows oppression.
Yeah, and that's something I don't think, and I think it was kind of funny because a lot of people I don't think until very recently realized, and people are kind of like, oh my God, why are black people so active? I'm like, that's been in the black community for a while. Like any meeting of black people, that gets brought up because we know that story sort of. We shared it like, oh, stolen land, we know all about that. Dispossession, say less. And so there's been that solidarity there, and I think the lack of responsiveness by the Democratic Party to that and not understanding, it's white students at Columbia protesting, but your biggest, most reliable voting bloc, we've been on that train for a while. So if you thinking we were just gonna let that go and not complain about that, that was not gonna happen. And so it's yeah, but that idea of justice in it all, that's a perfect way to put it. There's been a terrible injustice done, and until people are made whole, somewhat whole, kind of whole, this is never going to stop. And I think that's an excellent takeaway from all of this.
Thank you.
Yes. Well, we're gonna wrap this up because my voice is on its way out. So, why don't you let us know where you can buy the book and how we can keep up with you and your story?
You can buy the book at Amazon, of course,
Mhm.
and it's going to be carried by Ingram, which means it will have wider distribution than just Amazon.
Yeah.
I hope that it will shortly be in bookstore.org because
Mhm.
they support local bookstores. And I also have written a memoir about Palestine and several couple of novels that are set in the refugee camps. I did my doctoral dissertation about the women in the refugee camps. And so just look for Hillaj. I've got at Sage Tea Books is where I'm having I will put on my website. I'll have more things about the books and about Muhammad and other things he's written. And I'm going to have some of his articles that he wrote, literally hundreds of articles. That's what he did for a living when we came back here, was write and speak about Palestine.
Well, I would definitely love to talk to you about maybe having a couple of those at CameronJournal.com, because that would be exciting, and get you a nice distribution. So we'll talk about that later. But yeah. So, well, thank you so much for coming on the Cameron Journal podcast.
Thank you for having me.
That's all for this episode of the Cameron Journal podcast. Thank you so much for listening. Visit us online at CameronJournal.com. We're on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and I love to talk to my followers and listeners, so please feel free to get us on social media at Cameron Cowan on Twitter, and we'll see you next time on the Cameron Journal podcast.